All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and we're really delighted to be hosting veteran journalist, author, and commentator Juan Williams, who's here to talk about his new book, New Prize for These Eyes, The Rise of America's Second Civil Rights Movement. What a day. What a day. We've had a presidential inauguration overlapping with Martin Luther King Jr.'s day. So it's all the more timely for us to be having this event and having Juan lead us in a discussion of the recent history and potential future of civil rights in this country. I'm sure Juan is familiar to many of you from his years on TV and radio and in print. He's been a longtime presence on the Fox News channel, serving for a time as a co-host of the roundtable debate show, The Five. Nowadays, he's a senior political analyst on the network, still regularly challenging the orthodoxy of Fox's conservative standard bearers whenever he gets a chance. Previously, Juan spent the 2000s reporting and hosting for NPR, and before that, he worked for more than 2 decades for the Washington Post, where he was a national correspondent and a political columnist. Juan also has written a number of previous books, among them works on the American Civil Rights Movement, on Thurgood Marshall, on African American religion, on Black colleges and universities, and on the current state of Black leadership. His last book 6 years ago was on what he called Donald Trump's war on civil rights. And his new book is a kind of follow-up to his very first, back in 1988, Eyes on the Prize, about the civil rights years from 1954 to 1965. This new one describes the rise of a new 21st century civil rights movement that, in Juan's telling, came with the ascent of Barack Obama to the presidency, amid talk of America's having entered a post-racial era. Such talk proved illusory, of course, as a white right-wing backlash emerged, and many examples of racial tension and racial inequality persist to this day. Nonetheless, Juan, as you're going to hear more about in a minute, he sees another great fight for racial justice taking shape, one that's built on the achievements of the earlier civil rights activism, but is distinctly different, facing a different context, pursuing different goals, and needing to employ different tactics than before. Ron recounts the development in recent years of what he calls the second civil rights movement and outlines the challenges ahead for yet a third movement. And some of those challenges were underscored today in Donald Trump's inaugural speech when, among other things, he declared the end to DEI in government. So Juan's been telling the civil rights story in various ways for much of his career, and he brings to this latest effort a lot of authority and a lot of insight. His new book provides a very informed look at civil rights in America today, and while it makes clear how much more progress is needed, the final chapter does offer some hope for the way forward. For one thing, Juan asserts there is more positive thinking about racial diversity today, and it is impossible to ignore. Please join me in welcoming Juan Williams.
Brad, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to be here, to see some of my friends in the audience. Thank you for coming out on a very chilly night. It's deeply appreciated to see friendly faces. I just want to start with a personal note. Brad, it may be of interest to you. when I wrote Eyes on the Prize, America's Civil Rights Years, it accompanied a PBS series by the same name, and the series was a big hit. The book did well, but it took me around the country to speak. But when I came home to Washington, D.C., the most intriguing invitation arrived. Would I speak at Politics and Prose on a Sunday afternoon to a group of elementary school children? And that's when Politics and Prose was across the street, and Carla Cohen came herself to help me understand how to speak to a group of elementary school children about something as complex as race. Now, my wife is in the audience. She will tell you I have trouble speaking to children about anything. But it proved to be one of the most memorable events, exercises, would you say, Brad? Exchanges that I've ever had about race in America. Because a child's view of race is really different. Is really different. I'm always reminded, I forget which comedian tells the joke about being on an airplane seated next to a child, and she says, "Do you know kids really like race jokes?" And I'm like, what? But kids, it seems, have an understanding of race that is not totally naive. It's just more accepting. It's just more like, oh yeah, that person's white, that person's black. It's just different. Anyway, let me try today with, maybe some of you grew up and you're here today all these years later that was 1988. And so here we are, almost 40 years later. And for me, coming here is, again, as I was saying to Brad earlier, a little bit of a bookend experience, because the first book, Eyes on the Prize, America's Civil Rights Years, published 1988. And now this book, here I am 70 years old, and this book really picks up on so much that was built, so much that was started, so much that was ignited by that first movement. This book makes a very important point. The important point is that we are in the midst of a second civil rights movement. And that second civil rights movement is having as much, if not more, impact than the first movement. Now, when I say this generally, I find lots of people look at me curiously. They just can't believe it. They don't understand it. They don't see a second movement in action. And they're dubious about this. And I take into saying, let's look at it in these terms. In the first movement, you had Dr. King, whose birthday we celebrate today, as you mentioned, come here to Washington, D.C., 1963. Arguably the highlight of the movement was his Great March on Washington, with 250,000 people one day marching, and you know where he marched, right down on the National Mall, and he gave the I Have a Dream speech. And the reception was phenomenal, and it made front page news across the nation. Fast forward. After George Floyd was killed, we had marches led by, or under the banner of, Black Lives Matter. There were thousands of marches all over the United States, in fact, all around the world, globally. Millions of people marched, millions. And whereas the Dr. King March was a one-day affair, these Black Lives Matter marches have become a 24/7 fire online. Messages that go viral, tweets, images that go viral, conversations and debates, all about Black Lives Matter and about race relations, and about race relations in this moment. Here we are in 2025. And today, I think you see some reflection of that in what now I say president, I'm slow, I keep wanting to say president-elect, what President Trump had to say about diversity, equity, and inclusion, that he wants it off the books. This is an argument that's really a response, if you will, to Black Lives Matter, changing the consciousness of this nation in some very vital ways, so that so many of the conversations, so many of the discussions about policy, about cultural representation, about what we teach children in our schools is born out of a new shape to a racial discussion that was formed by the pressure created during Black Lives Matter. Right now, if you think of the term identity politics, it is so often used by people who intend to undermine the power of Black Lives Matter. They want to make the charge against people like me, many of you, that we are focused on race and that results in discrimination, and that the Constitution, the principle of fairness, equality, and justice for all, requires us to be race neutral. The contrary position would be that in America, we've never been race neutral. We always had preference, of course, for white people and arguably for white men, and even more so maybe tall white men. But we've always had some racial distinction and preference in American life. And the whole premise of diversity, equity, and inclusion was to somehow make efforts to repair and to assert that there would be a level playing field and that people who could achieve would have the chance to achieve without regard to race, gender. The contrary argument would be, oh no, when you talk about DEI, you're talking about who gets into college. Is it going to be my kid or that minority kid or that woman? When you talk about DEI, it's who gets hired. Is there a quota now for hiring more Latinos? And when you're talking about DEI, you want to teach my children about the horrors of slavery, of lynching, of inequality. You want to start talking about Japanese being interned in the United States. These things are upsetting to my children, and they make them feel bad. President Trump said it today, make them feel bad as children about being American. This, to me, is an essential part of a conversation if we are to understand that we are in the midst of a second movement. In some ways, I'm taken by the idea that when you have "we shall overcome" as kind of the theme of the first movement, it's 3 words. But now you have 3 more, Black Lives Matter, and I would argue another 3, maybe 4, now that I'm counting in my mind, that's generated on the basis of Black Lives Matter, and that's Make America Great Again. That these 2 are in direct conflict in our politics, in our culture, and that it's important as we understand this moment in history that we make sense of that conflict. It's just absolutely essential. Right now we are having, to my mind, difficulty perceiving that we are in the midst of a second movement because people who went through the first movement regularly say to me, so Juan, who is the Dr. King of the second movement? And I say, well, I don't think there is a Dr. King of the second movement. In fact, the people who created the first movement, and recall what I said about the powerful role played by the internet in this movement, the people who created Black Lives Matter after Trayvon Martin was killed in Florida reacted to the fact that the man who shot him at first was not even arrested by police, and then later, after being arrested and prosecuted, acquitted by a jury. And their response to the idea that this young man, 17 years old, walking home with candy and iced tea, wearing a hoodie, pants hanging down, and this guy perceived him as a threat, a threatening young black male. and then gets involved in a confrontation. Martin doesn't have a gun. He has a gun. Martin gets shot and killed. But the whole idea of self-defense carries the day. But these women, all the way across the country in California, said Black Lives Matter. Trayvon's life mattered. And this becomes a national, and as I said, a global movement. But when you have that moment, you create three leaders: Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrisse Cullors. And part of their creation of Black Lives Matter in that moment was to make the case that they didn't want to be the first civil rights movement. They didn't want hierarchical leadership. In some cases, they said they didn't want patriarchal leadership. Subsequent to that, as we went through other instances of young people being engaged in violent conflict with police, they made the case, in fact, that they don't know what's best for a civil rights movement in Washington, D.C., Cleveland, Ohio, Miami, Florida, San Diego, California, that it's local people living there, having that experience, who are best equipped to set the agenda for their community. Now think about this. They're making an implicit argument that the Dr. Kings, the Whitney Youngs, the Roy Wilkins, even the Malcolm X's, all in New York, by the way. That was kind of the headquarters of the first civil rights movement. The people there who would determine when marches took place, who would set the agenda, who would deliver the message to newspapers and television networks largely based in New York, they're making the case that that kind of centralized leadership is out of step with the time and out of step with the fact that this is a viral movement. So they rejected it, and the consequence is that there is no Dr. King for the second movement. The other day, someone said to me, well, what about someone like Stacey Abrams? Would you consider Stacey Abrams, the woman in Georgia who ran for governor and has led a movement against voter suppression in her state? Would you say she is a Dr. King? In her state, in her locale, you could make that case. And I think she has a broader national image, but she is not the equal of a Dr. King. And I don't think that she, if she was standing here or seated here today, would make that case. Instead, what you have is millions of ordinary people, if you will, investing energy, thought, and at times marching in the name of Black Lives Matter. And the opposition is very, very interesting. The first civil rights movement, when we think about an agenda, clearly the agenda was ending legal segregation. That's why the subtitle of my first book, Eyes on the Prize, was America's Civil Rights Years, 1954 through 1965. 54 would have been the Brown decision in the Supreme Court. 65 would have been passage of the Voting Rights Act. And before that, the year before, 64, passage of the Civil Rights Act. So what you're getting is movement that's making the case to the government, the federal government, there's a need to enforce citizenship rights for people of color in the United States, whether it's ending legal school segregation or asserting that Black people have a constitutional right to equal treatment in terms of buses, hotels, and of course, at the voting booth. That's the agenda for the first movement. The opposition to that movement, you'll recall, were people like the Ku Klux Klan, were people like George Wallace, the governor, who came out and said that it was up to him and to people like him to live their life as they chose. And they did not want to necessarily associate with people of color. And the opposition then, in terms of those segregationist politicians, grew in terms of larger fights about what it meant to have equality, the big fights in Boston over school busing and the like. That was the opposition then. Here we are in the course of a second movement, and the second movement has moved away from the Bull Connors of the world, a famous sheriff down in Birmingham who used water hoses, dogs, and batons to beat people who wanted the right to vote, has moved to Proud Boys and other white supremacist groups who make the case against what they call replacement or replacement theory. It's a different kind of opposition. If you think back to the march that resulted in death in Charlottesville, you recall there were Proud Boys marching with tiki torches saying Jews will not replace us. Not only that, they believe that a lot of the immigrants coming in are intended to replace us. And not only replace us in terms of taking jobs and the like, but to vote with those liberal Democrats against Republicans. This is upsetting on some level. I mean, it seems so bizarre, but it's a reality. And it's a reality that is opposed to the notion of diversity under the flag of saying that there's an effort to replace whites who feel, especially in some parts of the country, that their main street has been hollowed out, that the factories have gone overseas, that they're struggling with inflation. And their argument is, we shall not be forgotten, we shall not be abandoned by our leadership. And Donald Trump says to them that diversity, inclusion, equity is part of an effort to have them replaced. And that argument seems to have had some hold in terms of our 2024 election. This loathing for identity politics, it really leads then to conversations about fundamental values and norms in a society that is in the midst of tremendous demographic shifts. Thinking back to when I was here across the street talking to those kids, America was still in the 1980s, more than 85% white. The largest minority, Black people, about 10% of the population. Conversations about race largely went in terms of Black and white people, and the white people were dealing, oftentimes the conservatives would say, with guilt politics. What about slavery? What about segregation? Da, da, da. And the Black people were dealing oftentimes with, are you strong enough to stand up for yourself, make the case for the damage that has been done to you and your family or community by racial discrimination? And so this was the kind of limits of the racial discourse in that moment. We come forward to today, the largest minority group in America is the Latino community. We come forward to today, and there are, I think sometimes people miss this, the largest growing minority in the country is Asian. We come forward to today, there are more Black people than there were back in '88 when I was here, now about 13% of the population. And the white population has decreased and now is around the low 60% range. This is a very different America, set up for a very different conversation about race, because now it's a matter of conversations not only between Black and white, but between Black and Latino, and also between Asian and white. All of these conversations are going on. Finally, I think this is a really, again, underreported, underappreciated aspect of Black Lives Matter. But there's an emphasis there on LGBTQ rights in Black Lives Matter. And as a result, you see gender arguments take place. Again, today, in his inaugural address, Trump was very clear, a man is a man and a woman is a woman. And we're not going to allow any such confusion about transgender rights to enter into the conversation. Well, I'll leave that alone for a moment. But I will say this, that when you have some appreciation of the power of abortion rights, of gay rights, as factors in the larger debate about what it means to have equity and justice for all in America, it changes the conversation. It forces you to start thinking more broadly about where we're going and who we protect in terms of constitutional rights. What the court did, of course, was to take away the constitutional right to an abortion. That's an example of what we're talking about. Right now, the federal government makes an effort to acknowledge that children who seek transgender status and surgery have some rights. Trump is saying that will be undone. And if you're following the argument about the military even, the argument there is, oh, all these arguments about diversity and inclusion in the military somehow dilute the true purpose of the military, which is to kill our enemies, that it weakens us to have women especially in combat roles. So all of this leads to the suggestion that we might be better off if we didn't have to deal with race. It just makes so many people uncomfortable. It raises so many issues. And if only somebody would shut up, we could make America great again. We could go back to America of the 50s and 60s when the majority was very clear, the rules were very clear, the hierarchy, the social status was very clear. Yet, one last note, especially today, as we see this contrast between the King holiday and the Trump inauguration. A lot of people in my world in politics say to me, well, you're making the case that we are in the midst of a second movement, but did you notice how many young Black people, young Latino people, voted for Trump? And I say, I sure did. I read the polls. I can see what happened. I say it's also the case that even after I read the polls, I see it's like 85% of Black people voted for Harris. But it's true, about a quarter of young Black men voted for Donald Trump, and about half of the Latino men voted for Donald Trump. Now, there's a range of theories as to why this took place. I happen to think that a lot of the kind of brassy, boisterous, boastful attitude reflected by Donald Trump appeals to young people who think, you know what, to hell with the system. System's not meeting my needs. I don't see my community as safer. I don't see my schools getting better. I don't see that I have more job opportunities with the status quo. And Trump is the agent of chaos, so I'll go with anybody who's going to change and shake things up. And that's what he represented to them. And I think you're going to see more of that, sadly, as we become a more diverse society. And instead of focusing on the racial impact of a president like Trump, people, largely out of self-interest, say, well, I'll ignore that for the moment as long as we get big changes that shake up the status quo. I remember from the first inaugural that he spoke about American carnage. Today, he spoke about violence in American streets again. And it's not a big wink and nod to me. I understand what he's saying about cities and about minority populations in those cities and immigrant populations in those big cities to people who live, his base, mostly in small towns and rural areas. He's saying our way of living in these big cities is wrong. He's saying that, in fact, it's a drag on American society and keeping America from being great again. That's why when I think about a third civil rights movement, I think we need a movement that's able to respond to that kind of argument coming from Trump and his base. Part of it, especially with regard to big cities, is the idea that Black Lives Matter wants to defund the police. Black Lives Matter is so focused on mass incarceration, they want to let violent criminals out of jail. Black Lives Matter is sympathetic to criminals who would go into our drugstores, shoplift, and leave us to go into stores where everything is locked up and we can't even find the shaving cream or whatever. And that is evidence to him of the negative power of Black Lives Matter. And it resonates with a lot of people. But the contrary argument is that if you come in to America today, you come into a society in which there is income inequality. And that income inequality disproportionately impacts the minority population. And that income inequality is what leads people to make, in my mind, bad decisions about behavior, decisions that can lead to criminal acts, including shoplifting. That's not a condemnation of a more racially diverse society. That's a condemnation of people failing to react to changes within the society, changes that require us to really have discussions. And it requires for people who care about racial equity and progress in the society that we deliver a message about how we can deal with police effectively, because we want, at least I want police protection for me, for myself, my family, my home. How we deal with arguments of, oh no, these are people who don't believe in that. How do you deal with arguments for people who say, oh, these DEI people just want to give away admissions to select colleges and to the best jobs? Maybe you would point out that past discrimination meant that people who did achieve excellence oftentimes were denied opportunity on the basis of race, religion, and ethnicity. And maybe if you understand the need for more coalition building, you would see that people involved with Black Lives Matter would reach out to people involved with pro-abortion rights stances and people involved in Latino rights and Asian rights. And you would see people involved in white progressive politics joining into this new coalition intended to say that if we are to go forward as an American people in this great mix, so much greater than what I experienced 40 years ago when I wrote the first Eyes on the Prize, that we have to see common interests, common goals, and we have to be willing to discuss race and not simply in some kind of visceral way pull away from any racial discussion out of fear of saying the wrong thing or having people condemn us for wanting to have a better understanding of how we can live together honestly while talking about race. As I said to you, kind of the anthem for the first movement was "We Shall Overcome." Yesterday at my church, I was interviewed, I was telling Bradley, by my 3 children about this new book. But before we went on stage to have this discussion, the church choir sang "We Shall Overcome," and then they sang some stanzas from Eyes on the Prize. And it was so striking to me to hear this. It sounds old-fashioned, you know, to hear something like "We shall overcome." But today, we are really called upon to not dismiss the idea of civil rights as old-fashioned, as traditionalist, as church-based, and to understand that you can be in a major corporation having discussions about DEI. You can be in the schoolhouse having discussions about the curriculum. You can be in the university or the corporation having discussions about admissions and hiring. You can be walking down the street having a sense of fear of crime and understand you are having a conversation about race in America in a very real way. These are requirements now for people who are fully conscious of who we are and where we are in history. Thank you very much.
So if you have a question, can you just step up to that mic, please?
Good evening.
Hi.
First of all, I want to say I grew up in Washington, D.C., and naively will say that I didn't face racist issues directly.
Right.
Went to public schools, had good white and black teachers. But anyway, I have a couple of questions. The first question is about civil rights movements. So sometimes some of us refer to the Martin Luther King era and the subsequent years as the modern civil rights movement, thinking that civil rights movements began in 1619 or around that time. I wanted you to comment about that. And then can I ask my other question, then you can do both?
No, I'll do one at a time.
Okay, sure.
It's easier for my old brain.
Okay. I got an old brain too. It's okay.
So let me get this. The idea that you're saying is that people think of the first civil rights movement as the civil rights movement.
Most of the time, when people refer to the civil rights movement today, they're talking about the 50s and 60s, was
Right.
Martin Luther King. But there were movements before then.
Sure.
So what do you
Of
think
course,
about that?
obviously. It's not that they were movements per se, as you had people who were activists in asserting the rights of Black people to be treated fairly and to live as full citizens of the nation. Now, obviously, if you think back to 1619, there's not much. But if you come forward in time then to even the writing of the Constitution, you can see how, in fact, race becomes the original sin, and the original sin flowers and eventually leads to a civil war over just that issue. You know, it's funny, you even have people today who don't want to acknowledge that the Civil War was over race. So, yeah, I mean, but this to me is obvious. Yes, there were people all along. Frederick Douglass stands out as a leader. I mean, Thurgood Marshall, whom I've written a biography of, stands out as a leader at the very beginning of what I think of as the mid-20th century movement.
Okay, thank you. And the next question is this. I live in a retirement community where there's a library. Occasionally, the library staff, who happen to be volunteers, put up displays of materials from the library collection. And I have a short memory too, so I had to write some things down. On more than one occasion, I have offered to add some materials to the collection. For example, they did a display about books about Washington, D.C., but didn't have anything about Anacostia, LeDroit Park, or the book Chocolate City. My husband and I, who happen to be trained librarians, and at this library, the people who run the library, as far as I know, are not trained librarians. But when we offered copies of some of these other books, they said they only wanted to use materials from their collection. So my question for you is this a civil rights matter? And or what can people do in situations like this?
I guess you have to debate it, discuss it. You may have to compromise. But I think if you felt strongly about it, you could have books available elsewhere and let people know that you have a collection of your own that's very rich and maybe richer than what's being offered over there for use by others.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
I think, unfortunately, one of the lessons that some Democrats may take from our 2024 election is if we are going to preserve our democracy, that we need to talk less about race.
Right.
That unity, and I think there's been a mischaracterization of the, quote, white working class or the working class, and forgetting that people of color are a significant, if not majority, of the working class. But I'd like you to talk a little bit about the intersection of class and race as we try to preserve a multiracial democracy.
Sure. So Brad touched on this in the introduction, that part of my argument about the second movement is that it begins with a speech in 2004 by Barack Obama at the Democratic National Convention. And in that speech, I think most of you will recall, Obama makes the argument that we are not a Black America, white America, not Latino America, Asian America. We are the United States of America. We are one people. And when he made this argument, it started discussions about a post-racial America. In other words, an America that was now moving beyond the first movement and that opened new doors, new horizons, and new optimism, kind of a forward-looking energy given to race in America. Very positive. And I don't know how many of you might remember this, but when he then rode that wave to become president of the United States, Ebony magazine had a cover, and on the cover it said, is it in my lifetime or in our lifetime? Because this seemed unbelievable. There's a black president. Can you believe this? We've never seen anything like it. And again, there was tremendous optimism and more discussion about America entering a period of post-racial understanding. Now, that then generated a backlash. The backlash begins in two ways. He was dealing with a financial crisis, and people wanted to know why he bailed out the big banks and not the little guy, Wall Street versus Main Street. But it really became apparent in terms of populist opposition with the Affordable Care Act, then dubbed Obamacare. And what you saw was people saying, especially disproportionately working class whites, to your question, saying, you're going to disrupt my health insurance policy, you're going to disrupt my tax dollar spending to help those people, these ne'er-do-wells, these poor people. Oh, the president's black, and these people are disproportionately people of color. And now there was an energy to this populist Tea Party movement that suggested that Obama was not, as he argued, president of all Americans, but that he really was the black president. And again, I think it led to racial division that Donald Trump played on with the birther movement, that Obama wasn't even really an American, division that Trump would play on when he talked about people coming into this country to vote for Democrats, these immigrants. The whole idea of racial division continued throughout Trump's first campaign, through his first term. I think it has continued to this moment, the day of his second inauguration. And a lot of it is aimed at the white working class. You think about his argument about the immigrants eating the pets, the cats and dogs in Springfield, Ohio. He's playing on anxiety and discomfort over the presence of a Haitian immigrant population in town, even though that population is there legally, and even though the people who run the factory say we need these workers. And for the most part, these are good neighbors. But again, there is that racial anxiety. There's just no denying it. Now, in talking about race and class, I think that you have to come to grips with the idea that the people who want to make the case that they are being replaced, or the people who are vulnerable to the argument that they are being replaced, are mostly white working class people who are losing jobs or losing income, struggling in this economy at this time, who see it as a limited pie, and somehow the pie is being given more and more to the minorities, to the women, to the immigrants, and that they are being denied their larger share of that pie. But to my mind, your point is well taken. So many people in the working class are people of color, are immigrants. One of the big changes, and I don't think anybody can deny it, is you go around this town, but you go around New York or LA, anything. Who's doing the construction work? The service jobs? Who really is involved in often healthcare? So many of those jobs, working class jobs, are occupied by people of color. I don't think there's any doubt about it. But you can argue with me if you want, but I don't think there's any doubt. But if you are in a white working class community, you're subject to sense of anxiety over the idea that somebody may be coming in to take your job, much less to have arguments about what your kids are being taught. One of the realities of the second civil rights movement, again, tied to demographics in my mind, is that people of color have more voice in this moment than ever before. More voice in saying, this is what I think is legitimate history. We heard about 1619 a moment ago. More voice in saying, I want to be treated in this way. My lived experience in this moment is not in keeping with the promise of a Civil Rights Act, a Voting Rights Act, or even, and this is, so striking to me, given my age, not in keeping with the promise that came from having Black elected officials. Remember, the big deal about the Voting Rights Act in '65 is, okay, you're going to get more Black elected officials. They'll do a better job of representing people of color, and they'll protect their rights and deliver better results for them. Well, you think about a place like Baltimore. I'll leave D.C. out of it for the moment. But Baltimore, they now have a Black governor. They just elected a Black senator. The mayor of the biggest city is Black. Do I think that Black people living in Baltimore think, wow, things are great? No. I think if they think about their school system, if they think about poverty, if they think about violent crime, they say, I don't see the difference. The realities and promise of the first movement in terms of a lived experience has not been a positive result for a lot of people. Now that's, again, especially for working class, Blacks, Latinos, etc. But if you're talking about white people looking inside that situation, it leads to Donald Trump saying, what the hell do you people of color have to lose with me as president? Why not try something different? Have the Democrats delivered for you? And again, these are the conversations that are taking place. And they're different conversations at an all-white dinner table, an all-Black dinner table, a Latino dinner table. But these are the conversations and the impact of race on our lives in this moment. And I'm just asking us all to be aware of it, to tune into the idea that we are in the midst of a second civil rights movement that may have greater impact even than the first.
Good evening. One
Hi.
of the things that you said, Mr. Williams, a couple of different times was that there was progress and then backlash. And there's this quote about the road to racial justice, that it's a long and thorny road beset by pitfalls.
Yes.
And so what is it that you would offer to those of us who are interested in promoting the oneness of humankind and the nobility of all humans, and that diversity is our strength, during this era or on a long and thorny road? Like, how do we keep our eyes on the prize today?
Wow, this is a powerful question tonight. Because tonight, I think there are a lot of people who are despairing over the inauguration of President Trump and who say, well, if it is a matter of Black Lives Matter is one of the powerful forces in this time, and Make America Great is the other major force in this time, it sure looks like Make America Great Again is winning if they just put Donald Trump back in the White House. And my feeling about this is life, history, all of it goes in cycles, back and forth like a pendulum. But the pendulum doesn't stop. Time doesn't stop. And our energy, our ability to, I think of it in terms of people who do sculpture, our ability to get our hands into the muck and mire of that history and mold and shape and work does not stop simply because the pendulum has swung one way or the other. And I would hope that people, again, being aware of where we are in history, that we are in the midst of an ongoing movement, would say, okay, I understand that at this moment, the pendulum is swung and it sure doesn't look good. But it's not the case that all time is stopping. The pendulum continues to swing.
Thank you so much for coming.
My pleasure. Thanks you for coming out. Georgetown Day School in the house. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Oh, wow. This is wonderful. Thank you. So I was wondering, I think that one of the most common accusations that the second civil rights movement is facing, or if you want to say third civil rights movement, or fourth, depending on how long a view of history one takes, but anyway, is that maybe it needs to be more focused on practical achievements. So when people say, "Oh, DEI has gone too far," what they mean is, "Oh, we have to do performative things like diversity statements or land acknowledgments." Do you think that the second civil rights movement needs to focus more on practical aims, or do you think it already has the right balance between the more practical things and the more symbolic things?
No, Leo, thank you for the question. I think a lot of this is pragmatic, practical things. Like I was talking to you about how there's an effort to undermine the power of Black Lives Matter by saying, oh, those people want to defund the police. They are the people who are all for the criminals versus our lives, and we are not criminals. The most powerful ad of the Trump campaign was suggesting that Vice President Harris is with jail transsexuals who want surgery. She's for they, them, and Trump is for you. I mean, it's very clear that that's a very divisive argument. I mean, remember, people make the case, Black Lives Matter, suddenly you see signs that say Blue Lives Matter, right? It's an effort to undercut the power of the movement on very practical reasons. And people say, I don't want boys playing on the girls' team or in the girls' bathroom. And again, people feel some anxiety and threat, and it undercuts the larger message that we need to have some better understanding of gender equality and people who have different sexual identity in this time, that we can do it. But that's not a matter of symbolism. I think it's a matter of having practical discussions and solutions when you see those charges and saying, no, we're not about defund the police. No, we're not about having people feel uncomfortable because there's a boy in the girl's bath. That's not the issue. And trying to make that case can be difficult. Part of the problem, by the way, I think in something like the Harris campaign was they were always on their back foot. They're always having to defend the charge coming from the Trump campaign that says this is not common sense to have boys playing against girls. And there's lots of arguments to be made about this, but the power of that argument is such that instead of making your own argument, you're busy now responding to someone else. And I think that's just a losing hand. So yes, for my money, you got to have practical solutions. You got to have positive images. You got to have the ability to say, this is what's good for you, America, be you white, black, Latino, Asian, whatever. We've got to come up with an America that works for all of us, and everyone can prosper, and everyone's children can be comfortable in learning. That's what we've got. We got to be more positive, and to me, that is not symbolic. That is pragmatic. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. I've tired them out, rather.
Anybody else?
Please, I'll take another question. It looks to me like you want to get up and ask a question. Okay.
I try to be disciplined. I got the book, but I haven't read it yet. Juan, a long time ago, you wrote Enough.
Yes.
And it was a critique of something that you began to touch on, which is the representation, the black people being represented by black leaders, and rent-seeking behavior coming in at that level. I'm interested in your understanding, now that we're in this multiracial group, immigrants and so forth, what about second-order relationships? The black community having a hard time with immigrants, let's say the Latino community, getting extra rights, let's say, from the state as they come in illegally, or the Asian community trying to participate in the legacy of the black rights community in backlash to the China virus, et cetera. What are your thoughts on run-seeking behavior and leadership in this new second-order relationship?
What does run-seeking behavior mean?
Well, I thought it seemed that you were saying that many of the black leaders were for themselves in not really promoting healing and progress.
I think
In this
that's
book, enough.
in enough. The argument is made. Why is it that black leaders, this book is now 15 years old or something, but why in that age don't you see black leaders leading marches against the drug dealers?
That's right.
In the community, right?
Right.
Instead, they're leading marches and they say, oh, well, something happened with the police, et cetera. But you say, wait a minute, look at the damage being done by the drug dealers in our community. Or why aren't they leading marches and saying, you know what, the schools are failing our kids, and why don't you see them engaged in that way? Now, let me come to the question you have about this book, which is why don't you see more coalition building?
That's correct.
Among racial groups, immigrant groups, and the like. I think this is a failure of the kind I was offering about black politicians when it comes to Black Lives Matter, that I don't see, given the high rate of immigration, and I'm not just talking illegal immigration, it's now the case that 1 out of every 6 Americans is born in another country. How is it that if you are involved in progressive politics in 2025, you aren't making an outreach to that community and making it clear you are welcome now to join in the great legacy of social change and the fight for social justice that was led earlier by the Black Civil Rights Movement? I just want to throw in a curious thought here. I talked to you about, in my mind, the second movement kicking off with Obama, and it's talk about, we're one America. It's so interesting that a lot of the activists in Black Lives Matter are highly critical of Obama.
Yes.
Because they think that here was a black politician who finally was in the Oval Office, kind of the height of American political power. And yet, they don't think that he made a big difference in terms of the quality of black life in America.
And may I add,
Please.
Because he was not really black.
Well, some would make that argument that he's not really black, that Michelle was the one that's really black and comes and has slavery heritage and all this. How self-defeating, how limiting, in my view. Instead of building, what you were involved in is backbiting. And I just don't think this is the step forward. When I think of a third movement, I think of people finding a way to come together. And with regard to this argument, it's a very intriguing argument. If you give me a second, I'll expand on it, which is to say, he said, why doesn't Obama talk about mass incarceration of black people? Or why doesn't he do something about the disproportionate share of people of color on death row? And then when he said, that's not my job, I'm the president of the United States, I'm not a black activist, I'm a black politician, people were disappointed. And even after Trayvon Martin was killed, he said, if you recollect, if I had a son, he would have looked like Trayvon. Guess what? There was a backlash. People said, what? Why are you bringing race into this? Right? And when, Henry Louis Gates, the Harvard professor, had a confrontation with a policeman. He was trying to get into his house after a trip. He didn't have the key. He was looking around the house. The neighbor calls. And then Obama says, why would a policeman arrest a man trying to get into his own home? And it was stupid. Then people say, oh, he took the side of the black man versus the white policeman. And it's that point, from a political viewpoint, you should know Obama's rating among white Americans never again got above 50%. It was it had a killing impact in terms of his approval in white America. I don't know that if he had been this black president that the activists wanted, that he would have won a second term. He didn't even talk about himself as a post-racial president. He simply said he's the president. He's the president of all people. But again, this refusal to compromise or to engage compromise or to even say I am willing to make deals with politicians like Obama, I think is a signal failure of Black Lives Matter and of progressives who want to say, oh, the establishment sucks, or this is bad, or politicians can't be trusted. You have to get in there and, as I said, get your fingers in the muck and mire and start to shift and shape what is to come if you're trying to change things. I think those are people who are change agents.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So Mary McLeod Bethune, 1948. I want to leave us on a hopeful note.
Please.
She gave us the model for how to do this, right? She helped Eleanor Roosevelt, mentored her, was taken by Eleanor to San Francisco to form the UN, helped Eleanor get all the delegates to unanimously pass the Human Rights Resolution. If we go to the wording of the Human Rights Resolution, right, we will not discriminate on the basis of national origin, race, sex, etc. That's the wording that it took our Congress 16 more years to pass as the Civil Rights Act of 1964, right? But that movement to get that passed was the 10 years before 1954.
Right.
Right? And the model was groups of groups, coalition building, right? So coalitions working together, grassroots, and working on that wording, which is exactly the wording that guess who is trying to work against, right? Do you want to comment on that?
I just think you're right. And I must say, you know, in my mind, as I was listening to you speak, I think back to the creation of the NAACP. And again, what you see is it's across racial lines, across gender lines. And part of it is making the case for women having the right to vote. And suddenly you see, you know, people joining hands to make something happen. And it's not limited by your race or your gender.
Or your religion?
Right. It's limited by your vision. Certainly not by your religion, right. But by your vision of what's possible. And, you know, it's almost, you know, I don't want to sound weak, but it's idealism. You know, so in this moment, second Trump inauguration, are we weak because we're idealists and we believe in human rights and seeing each other and our potential without regard to the shape and form or gender, color of skin? I guess you could say we're naive, but I believe we're the good people. Yeah.